I'd like to thank you and all the sponsors of this bill. I've supported responsible sentencing reform since I arrived here. I remember the first week I was here, Senator Booker and I talked about this for low-level, nonviolent drug offenders. The unfortunate thing I have is that this bill goes well beyond that. Great things are happening with criminal justice reform in my home state of Georgia, and we need to do the same thing here in Washington. So I fully support the effort. Some of the Corrections Act provisions in this bill actually do that. Unfortunately, I'm unable to support many of the changes that this bill makes to our mandatory minimum sentencing laws, as well as its retroactive features. The first problem I have is this bill significantly reduces the sentences of violent repeat offenders, not just drug offenders, including four-time felons sentenced under the Armed Career Criminal Act. I want to give you a brief example of one of these that can happen on this side of the equation. Judge Easterbrook of the 7th Circuit recently wrote an opinion in the U.S. versus Burnett, a case in which Illinois offender Albert Burnett was sentenced to a mandatory minimum of 15 years under the Armed Career Criminal Act. Burnett has an extensive criminal history and has been convicted 5 times for violent felonies, murder, twice for attempted murder, aggravated battery, and domestic battery. And that's in addition to his federal gun charge. If this bill becomes law, Burnett will be eligible for a 5-year reduction in his sentence. Contrary to a lot of misinformation out there, this bill goes well beyond low-level, nonviolent drug offenders. I've always believed that we need to take a hard look at how we deal with nonviolent offenders, and that's why I'm a co-sponsor of the Smarter Sentencing Act. But let's be clear, this is not that act. If it becomes law, this bill today reduces sentences for armed career criminals like Albert Burnett under Section 924E, serial violent felons, and drug offenders who use guns under Sections 924C, and high-level repeat drug offenders sentenced under Section 841. What's even more troubling is that these provisions apply retroactively, Mr. Chairman. We don't yet have reliable data even from the U.S. Sentencing Commission on how extensive the effects of these retroactive provisions will be, but they will affect many thousands of violent offenders and armed career criminals. That's thousands of old sentences federal prosecutors will be forced to relitigate, which means fewer resources for fighting current crime. My decision today also takes into account the releases by the Federal Bureau of Prisons that are already happening, and the fact that many of our states are seeing a spike in violent crime and unprecedented levels of heroin use has already been mentioned this morning. In the upcoming months, we're going to see over 13,000 federal offenders released under the current activity. And if this bill becomes law, we're adding potentially thousands of repeat violent felons into the mix because of the retroactive provision of this bill. Unfortunately, I cannot support this bill, although I do support the effort for reform for nonviolent drug offenders. I'm unable to support this bill. Mr. Chairman, I plan to offer some amendments later that will deal with some of my reservations, and thank you very much for allowing me to make this comment.
Senator, tell us.